Aloha. Colin, you want to put me on?
You're on.
Okay. I can't see myself this way. Aloha attendees, welcome to this another session of the Hawaii Book and Music Festival. We're coming up on the end of our 5th week with one more week to go. And it's my pleasure today to be the moderator for and talk, have a conversation with Scott Kikkawa, who broke through a couple of years ago with his first novel, or maybe it was published last year, I don't remember. Now he's known as a noir novelist. He's chosen a particularly special period in modern Hawaii history. And now we have a new novel called Red Dirt. It's published by Bamboo Ridge Press. And I think, I'm not sure, Scott, is it actually available yet?
I think it becomes available maybe at the end of this month, hopefully.
Okay. Yeah. I guess. I know we scheduled it late because we wanted to make sure that the books will be available at least soon afterwards. Anyway. So this one's called Red Dirt. The first one was called Kona Winds. Everybody in Hawaii knows what red dirt means. Everyone knows what Kona Winds means. I'd like to first get a sense of who you are and what you do, what you come from as a day job, so to speak. Where you went to school, the classic question.
Well, I am a graduate of Kaiser High School in Hawaii Kai. I went to and have my degree from New York University. This is a major in Islamic history and a minor in medieval and Renaissance studies, which got me a job at an insurance company when I came home. Well, actually, my first job was for a private investigator, which was due in no small part to my love of the detective fiction. Going to an insurance company was kind of just a natural segue because it's really being an investigator, but in-house for the largest client of most insurance or of most private investigators, which are insurance companies. I did that for maybe about 7 years before I entered law enforcement, first as a state investigator, and now presently as a federal law enforcement officer. I work for the Department of Homeland Security for the United States Customs and Border Protection.
Oh, so there's a real through line in your life and career to actually writing about it. Had you always wanted to be a writer?
No, this happened completely by accident, and it was pretty much a dare. My good friend, Dr. Jason Chun of UH West Oahu, and I were having a drink in Kaimuki one night in 2011, and he challenged me to write a book about this place, mostly because I had spent the evening complaining about how there was a lack of good noir fiction from Hawaii. There are exceptions, of course. I think Chris McKinney is one stellar example of a great noir writer from Hawaii. Alexei Melnick with his groundbreaking Tweakerville is another. And Rodney Morales has a very, very good book, one of my favorites, called For a Song. But the thing about Chris and Alexei and Rodney is that all of their work is set in the contemporary period. What nobody had done, as far as I knew, was to write a noir that was set during the time of noir's heyday, which was in the post-war era of America, here in Honolulu. So he challenged me to do this, and I did. And I think maybe about 8 years later, it came to pass 8 years, 9 years or so later.
So
Yeah.
what happened in those 8 years?
Well, it took me 2 years to finish a first draft of the manuscript. And I spent maybe about 2.5 years querying it out. I received rejections from over or right about 100 literary agents, most of them in New York City. But I did get a request for a full or partial manuscript about 20% of the time, which I understand is not bad. But of course, all of those ended in rejection. And they told me basically the same thing, which was while they liked the writing and they liked the story, they couldn't find a vision for selling it because they felt that the Hawaii I portrayed was too ugly for most American readers.
Oh, thank you, HTA. Yeah, that's fascinating. You at NYU, you did English literature, or medieval literature, and what was the other one?
Islamic studies. So
Islamic
Islamic studies was actually my major. My minor was medieval and Renaissance studies, which was a kind of a hodgepodge of history, architecture, and literature.
Oh, well, you make good use of them so far in the first two novels, because your main character is constantly envisioning himself in in those situations. No. You obviously have read a great deal of noir. Was that a long-standing passion?
Yes, it was. I think ever since late high school or early college, I have always been a fan of the writing of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, first and foremost, James M. Cain. So these are all contemporaries, and these are all writers who produced their work right about the same time. So from the late 1920s to about the late 1950s is kind of that period where I started reading a lot of writers who were productive in that time.
Yeah. So did you find you were imitating them or emulating them, or did you find your own voice quite easily?
Well, I would hope that my own voice has emerged, even in a gradual sense. It started off being a kind of an homage or a tribute to those writers and their styles. I like the timing of the dialogue and the subject matter that they tackled back then. So I tried to do that, but in a setting that was unique to me, something that I was familiar with, but I also wanted to put it in about the same period, because Hawaii history during the territorial years, I think, was a very interesting time and it was kind of fertile ground for that type of literature.
Yeah, well, in my reading, I mean, one of the most things that stands out particularly for me is the sense of place. You must have done a huge amount of research, because the detail you have of the streets, the addresses, what people wore. I mean, it's all really extraordinarily detailed. Did you do a lot of research?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for noticing. There was a lot of research that went into this. It was both research in the academic sense. I want to thank Dr. Bill Pewitt of the University of Hawaii West Oahu's CLEAR, Center for Labor, Education, and Research, for opening up the CLEAR collection to me. I got to handle a lot of primary source documents in my research. And they figured especially prominently into this manuscript for Red Dirt. I got to read handwritten notes of John Reinecke right off his legal pads. I got to read minutes from ILWU meetings, Jack Hall's minutes, things like that. I just feel bad that I didn't bring the white gloves in to handle those actual documents. I kind of just went in there and he told me, be my guest, look at anything you want, handle anything you want. And I did a lot of reading too, a lot of academic reading on the labor movements of the time here in Hawaii, ethnic studies, period ethnic studies, Andrew Lynn's book on the people of Hawaii, which goes back several editions to, I think maybe the late 1940s. And on top of that, there's anecdotal research. I talked to my mother quite a bit and asked her about what her impressions were when she lived through the period, and others who had actually lived through the period. So there was a lot of research that went into this: photo collections, state archives, photo collections, HPD's library, and a lot of touring buildings downtown. A lot of the folks at the Alexander and Baldwin building and places like that were extremely generous about letting me in and take photographs and answering my questions.
Well, I felt that I needed a hyperlinks to Google Maps quite often. Maybe on the online version, you can have that. I think a good way of setting up our exploration of the book, first of all, is if you could just, Colin, show the cover, please. There we go. Okay. That gives a really good feel for, for the book. Thank you. What I'd like you to do now is to read the prologue, which gives a really good sense of the setting. It's also beautifully written. Don't rush it. It's too good. And then I'm going to ask you to read the very first chapter, and then we can go from there. So start with the prologue.
All right. Spies, enemy aliens, traitors. This is what they called us to our faces. The nicer ones whispered it behind our backs. In the days after Pearl Harbor, we all did what we could to make ourselves as invisible as possible. A lot of things went straight into the trash. The Hinamatsuri dolls, the calligraphy and brush paintings, the silk kimono. Tosan even buried the swords in the back of the house under the tea leaves. Everybody stopped speaking in the mother tongue. Even the old timers forced themselves to use English. And where they couldn't, they shut the hell up. We were all trying to prove we were Americans. Dumping our sentimental ties to the old country wasn't proof enough. A lot of us stepped up and gave the ultimate proof: blood. We endured the taunts and racial slurs at Camp Shelby. Then we shipped off to endure the artillery and bayonets of the Wehrmacht. I gave my blood. Wally Yoshida gave his leg. A lot of others gave their lives. We gave everything so that everyone would leave us the hell alone. We came home to some fanfare, fat carnation lay, a parade or two, luau's and speeches. Then came the new names: Stalinist stooges, communists, traitors. Blood wasn't enough to appease the gods of sugar and shipping. They didn't want sacrifice. They wanted docility. There were too damn many of us, and we were too close for comfort. We asked for fair wages. They painted us red. I came back from the war and went to college in New York City on Uncle Sam's dime. There, I threw myself into Le Mort d'Arthur and learned a painful lesson about betrayal. It isn't a rejection. It's a choice. Like Lancelot choosing Guinevere over Arthur, I chose my country over my friends. Traitor. In atonement, or perhaps in denial, I took up sword and shield and swore an oath to defend. A 38 caliber sword and a shield that fit in my pocket. Not for the first time, I rode out to seek the Holy Grail under the banner of a country that called me traitor. I haven't found it yet.
Well, that's quite something. I think a neat way of coming into the book is, as I asked you just now, is to read chapter 1, and then we'll go into a bit of the history of the context.
Okay. It stuck out of the ground like it was meant to be grasped by the lucky guy who found it. Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is rightwise king born of all England. I half expected it to bear that inscription in gold. It looked almost regal jutting out of the red dirt of Cunha in the middle of a burned out cane field. It wasn't Excalibur's hilt though, and I bet my entire pension that Sir Thomas Malory didn't have this particular object in mind when he described the sword and the stone. I was looking at a bone, a human bone, a big one, a femur probably, and it was charred black. All over the island, there were men at work, howly executives sitting behind desks the size of mausoleums in their ballroom-like offices on Bishop Street, looking at papers that would double the size of their bank accounts. Pake shopkeepers on Kekauike Street in their stores crammed with junk, looking with suspicion at loiterers, hands wrapped around baseball bats under the counters. Japanese and Portuguese and Kanaka stevedores sweating on the docks, looking at the mooring lines and uttering silent prayers, hoping they wouldn't snap. Filipino laborers in the very field I was standing in, looking at the red dirt and picking up the burned stalks of cane and throwing them into the bed of a slow-moving truck. None of them had to see what I was looking at. None of their jobs required it. Mine did, for I'm a homicide detective, a hot, tired homicide detective whose wingtips would have to go into the trash after being assaulted by the red dirt. Shit, I should have worn an older pair. It's 1953, the year of the snake to us Orientals. Maybe even the year of the same snake Percival saw battling a lion on his quest for the Holy Grail, the serpent a harbinger in Percival's dream. Things to come. I wish I could see the future from while I stood in the middle of the sun-blasted field in Cunha, choking on the red dirt swirling in the air and sweating like a man awaiting the gallows. I couldn't. There were no visions that day of maidens on snakes and lions heralding the future. There was just a burned out bone sticking up out of the torrid soil. Heavy shuffling steps kicking up miniature orange-brown cyclones in the dirt came up from behind me and stopped on my right side. Dismembered and burned, somebody took their time doing it, said the voice belonging to the steps. Yeah, I said, it was done somewhere else. Then the remains were brought here and buried, but not deep enough. The big harvester unearthed the femur, though at first glance, it just looks like another burnt thing among the burnt cane stalks and leaves. I looked up to my right. Detective Lieutenant Gideon Hanohano of the Honolulu Police Department looked back at me with bags under his eyes. He always looked tired, but he always looked cool too. 6'2" and 300 pounds, the former lineman never broke a sweat, not even in the furnace of Cunha. The cane fields of West Oahu thrived in this heat, the land situated on the leeward side of the island too far away from the Ko'olau Mountains to get the passing showers when the trade winds pushed the clouds over their peaks. All the water for the crops came diverted from the windward side or from reservoirs that seemed impossibly far away. The field we stood in was nasty hot and dusty after the stalks had had their leaves burned off prior to harvesting. Kid Hanohano's big meaty fist came up out of his coat pocket filled with a couple of torpedo-shaped cigars. Have one, Sheik, he offered. I took one of the cigars and rolled it between my thumb and middle finger. Thanks, Gid, I said. I looked at the brown and white band near the pointed head of the cigar. Hey, Monte Cristo from Havana. You got great taste, Lieutenant. Page from your playbook. I can't go back to those smelly dime sticks since you introduced me to the Cubans. You're a pretty penny, though. You only live once. Like that poor soul. He looked down at the blackened bone. That's a little chapter.
Okay, well, that certainly sets the tone, the scene. It's a great example of the kind of detail that you give, but certainly about the red dirt. I can really feel it, and the heat, particularly on the west side. I think it'd be useful for attendees if you just gave a brief survey of what was going on politically at that moment.
Well, I think in 1953, and I chose that year purposely because in 1953, we're here in Hawaii, we're on the verge of kind of sweeping political change and sweeping economic change too, if you think about it. The World War II had brought about a lot of change to the economic hierarchy between the islands. One of the things I ran across in my research was that prior to the war, every island was pretty much on the same political and economic footing with each other. In fact, there were places like Maui and the Big Island that were that may have been more dominant economically than Oahu because of agriculture. Because agriculture was the primary industry back then. What had happened with the war was that the war effort generated a lot of industrial and logistic jobs that were necessary for the war effort. So what the war did was it changed things in the sense that Oahu became that dominant center of the economy of the entire state, or back then the territory, that it is today because of the war, because the war effort drew all of that employment, because they created all those jobs in order to support the war effort. What had happened right after the war is that the Nisei veterans who returned home from their service in the European theater, a few of them in the Pacific theater, they served in the MIS, came home, went to college on the GI Bill, and Japanese Americans of the second generation were US citizens by birth. They were to become the largest single ethnic voting bloc in the territory. And what would happen in 1954 in pivotal elections was that they would win a lot of elected offices. And what happened then is that would put the Democratic Party in the driver's seat of Hawaii for a very long time. Some would argue into today. And this happened in 1954 with those elections. So in 1953, you're seeing the last vestiges of that former power structure that existed from the time of the overthrow of the monarchy to post-war Hawaii, which was about a 50-year period, where the economy was all sugar and shipping. It was dominated by the Big Five, and the economy was kind of almost a near feudal economy, where you had a lot of contract labor that were kind of indentured to or stuck on the plantations. I learned recently that the plantation owners actually started baseball leagues in order to keep the second generation on the plantation and working on the plantation as kind of a lure that the best competition for baseball was on the plantations, therefore they shouldn't leave the plantation and seek jobs elsewhere. But that was the economy back then, and it was changing in 1953. So in 1953, you're right on the verge of political change, of economic change. And a lot of this was brought about by labor movements which had been going on since a little prior to the 1920s. And they picked up momentum throughout in
the Depression.
Yes, into the Depression. And certainly after the war, they really picked up momentum.
So, I mean, that's just a wonderfully fruitful setting for a novelist. And it's sort of amazing that no one's taken advantage of it that I'm aware of. to now for, well, there actually is relatively little historical writing about it so far. And it's all been focused on 19th century, not on the 20th century. Just to get to the book, do you write conceptually, or I'm going to put it this way, conceptually or organically? Do you know what the novel is going to be when you start, or does it just emerge as you write?
You know, I know that a lot of, well, especially mystery writers are asked that question. Are you an outliner, or are you a what they call a pantser, someone who writes by the seat of his pants? You know, I'm kind of neither. For Kona Winds, for the first book, I really had no idea what I was doing. So you could call that an organic process, where it was a lot of trial and error, and it was a lot of fixing things that didn't work and coming up with something cohesive at the end. And I'm glad that that someone thought it worked. But the second book, Red Dirt, I had a better idea of how to do this thing, how to write a book. And I had started off with an outline, but I found that 3/4 of the way, I threw everything out, and the outline, I changed the outline, or I changed the way that the book ended. So it ended up being a lot more organic, maybe about 3/4 of the way through the first draft. So the answer is maybe neither and both. The outline did give me some sense of confidence in sitting down and completing the thing, but in the end, I wrote to what made sense.
But the basic idea of the plot was there from the beginning, or that also emerged?
The idea was kind of there in the beginning. When I think of, I'm going to sit down and write a book, I just have a few elements in mind, and one of them is not really the plot. It starts with an inspiration. So Kona Winds was inspired by the 1949 strikes, and maybe what I imagined would be a plausible fallout of those 1949 strikes. Red Dirt was inspired by the Hawaii 7 trials, and how the House Un-American Activities Committee and the anti-communist witch hunts of the 1950s. Someone called McCarthyism. I think that's a little of a misnomer, because McCarthy was a senator. He wasn't in the House, and the House is kind of what led a lot of these efforts, or the efforts that came here to Hawaii. But the anti-communist witch hunt thing was something that I know a lot of people, including my own parents, who lived through this period, don't really talk about it much. And the more I did research on the period, the more I felt that this was a really good place to put a novel. So that's where the novel started, was with an inspiration, and then the other pieces fall into place.
But you have a marvelously ambiguous kind of guilt built into the main character. When he actually betrays his favorite teacher and the teacher's daughter, who happens to be the main character's girlfriend. I'm always saying about your girlfriend, because this novel's written in the first person, and I keep on thinking it has to be you, but it is obviously not. At least I don't think so. Anyway.
Oh no, yeah, it's this is not an alter ego of mine. He's a completely made up person.
Yes, but he has a real life, and he has this. He has the classic flaws of a noir novel. He has a guilt about what he did in betraying his teacher and his girlfriend, and he has a couple of addictions. I mean, he drinks a great deal of whiskey and smokes a great many cigarettes. What was that about?
Well, yeah, and you're right when you call them addictions, because that's exactly what they were, and that's exactly what they are today. There are people today who are addicted to alcohol, to nicotine, to red meat and to all kinds of other things. It's just that in the 1950s, there was no stigma attached to it. They weren't considered addictions back then. They were more of a lifestyle back then. And that's, he lives more on the extreme of that lifestyle, like a lot of people did back then, much to their detriment later.
It made him uncomfortable. It didn't seem to be fatal. Not yet, anyway.
No, yeah, I mean, I'd be surprised if he lives to see 1975.
Yeah. Okay. So this character, the lieutenant, is a fascinating character. Was he there from the beginning? I don't remember from my reading of the first book. Was he there?
Yes, he was there in Kona Winds from the beginning. He was his boss in the homicide detail in the last book.
And the concept of, I think, is Geary. Yes, yeah, to talk about that. That's kind of what keeps him going, right?
Yeah, giri or obligation. It's something that when I think about it, it seems to be a relic of prior generations, something that they adhered to kind of more closely than we do. And when I say we, I mean Japanese Americans of the fourth generation, like I am. And what it roughly translates to in English is obligation, but it's a special kind of obligation. I think it's deeper and more organic, if you will, than a choice. It's kind of what holds society together, or what held society together in previous historic periods in Japan. Some would argue maybe to a certain extent today, but it's a value that was passed on in our immigrant community. And a lot of giri, or a lot of that type of obligation, is embodied in the story of the 47 Ronin, which is referenced in one of his flashbacks. And I put that in there to provide a contrast to the Arthurian legend, which he references throughout the book, just to show that he comes from two maybe competing and often not all the time complementary chivalric traditions, one from literature of the West and one from his upbringing.
Well, it's a culture that made Japanese soldiers so formidable.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. The plot is very intricate. Did it get more intricate as you wrote, as you found more twists, or is that really classic noir?
Well, it did get more intricate as I wrote. That kind of harkens back to your prior question, where I find that when you outline something before you sit down to write it, you can never come up with something that intricate. Either that, or you'd spend just as much time outlining it as you do writing the thing. My outlines are very, very sparse and very quick and very simple. And often I find that the details of the plot and the twists and turns come while I'm actually writing. So that happened organically, if you will, yeah. And that happened in the process.
And do the characters themselves take over?
Yes, they do. And in fact, oftentimes it's the characters themselves that are responsible for a lot of those turns in plot. Because as you're writing, you often think to yourself, when you're putting this down in the manuscript, well, this is not something this person would do. I think they would do this instead. And that opens up a different set of possibilities.
Give a couple of examples.
Well, I think that first off, I have to put this caveat down that a lot of this in my own writing is only possible because of the period I'm writing in. I've often told people that I think there is a golden age of crime and crime fiction, and that is not today. That was in a past era. That was in a time before litigation. It was in a time before advances in forensic science. It was a time before DNA. It was a time before lawsuits. And what that gives you is a possibility, especially in this book, of mistaken identity, where you find remains. And not to give away anything or throw in any spoilers, but it was not as precise a science as it is today. So that always opens a possibility of, well, not just who did it, but who was it done to, and that became something that turned on me in the process of writing. So yeah, read the book if you want to find out exactly what I'm talking about, but this is possible because of the period that it's written in.
There's one detail in the book, which is Frank Yoshikawa is the main character, the cop. He drives a red Cadillac. That really bugged me. Why? I mean, why would a cop? I mean, he couldn't trail anyone. He'd be seen a mile off. So what's that about?
Yeah, he takes a lot of ribbing for it too, as you probably read in the book. Yeah, it's not the ideal tail vehicle by any stretch of the imagination. What the red Cadillac was about was, and I think he talks about this in Kona Winds in the first book, that he considers it a survivor's prize of sorts. You know, he has leftover money from his GI Bill, and he comes home from the war with a bullet to the shoulder, which was not very major wound at all. He could still play baseball and go to the police academy and all kinds of things after he came back from the war, unlike a lot of his friends and companions over in Europe. But he decides when he gets home with his leftover GI Bill money after receiving his Eastern Seaboard education, that he has enough to put a down payment on a car. And that's what he does, is he puts a down payment on a car, but not just a car, the car. And the car of 1953 was the Cadillac Eldorado. That was the first year that that car came out. It was kind of the biggest deal maybe across the United States in terms of an automobile sex appeal. And what color are you going to get a convertible 53 Eldorado in if you want to make a statement? And that would be red. So he gets a red Cadillac. And this is, despite the fact that it's not conducive to his work as a detective, but it represents much more to him than a means of getting from point A to point B.
So in 1953, what kind of people would have a Cadillac? Not cops.
No, not cops.
No.
Executives, maybe. Old money folks. Yeah, the Cadillac was the car back then.
Well, it certainly must have made quite a statement. One of the things that I really enjoyed was the sense of this is an island, and it's not 6 degrees of separation, there's 2 degrees of separation. And you really get a sense from the story of, you don't have to go very far before you know someone who knows someone, you know. And that's must have been fun for you to play with.
Yeah, absolutely. That was that's always a lot of fun, and it makes to me more plausible a device that a lot of writers in this genre love to employ, which is the kind of like the coincidental meeting of individuals who turn out to be more than what they seem. And here that's a lot more plausible because everybody knows everybody. Of course, this person has something to do with something else because almost everybody does, and you can believe that. You don't have to suspend your disbelief that much. especially if you live here, to know that things like that are entirely possible. It is a double-edged sword, though. While I do enjoy the familiarity of this place and employing that as a device, it's also something of a, not really a hindrance, but it makes writing things in a historic period very tricky. One of those things is the portrayal of real-life characters. One of my favorite contemporary writers, or writer that lives today, is James Ellroy. James Ellroy once famously said that you can write anything you want to about anyone if they're dead. And Ellroy said that because actual historic or real life characters often appear in his books as characters. People like JFK, people like Marilyn Monroe or William H. Parker, the chief of police of the LAPD, will appear in his books as actual characters, and often not in a very flattering light. That might be fine for Los Angeles, but when you're here in Hawaii, that becomes a very problematic thing. Even when these folks are dead or have been long dead, they still have relatives or people who live today that remember them. And even when you portray them in a very good light, I think you still expose yourself to getting things wrong about these people and being called on it. So I've had to employ a really a device of my own making to get around that, which is these Romana Clef characters who are obviously based on real life people, but they are not them. They're fictitious characters. They're inspired by these real life people, but I make it clear that they're not these people because they exist in the world where these people actually do exist too. And that's my out or my way around it.
So I mean, the main characters are your invention, I assume, but all the minor characters that the main characters run into, are they based on real people?
Some of them are, yes, and some have caught those references.
So I was going to ask you, have they recognized themselves?
Well, most of them are no longer living. So when I talk about historic characters, yeah, I'm talking about folks like John A. Burns, folks like Koji Ariyoshi, folks like Doris Duke. These people make appearances as fictitious characters in my book, but they exist side by side along with the real characters, real people.
So coming to the next book, is it still in the same period?
When you say the next book,
I should say that you've actually completed the manuscript for the next book.
Yeah.
I assume it's the same characters.
Same protagonist, same characters, but set in very early 1954. So we're a few months after the events of Red Dirt. The title of this book is Chashu, and it is set mostly in Chinatown of Honolulu in early 1954, and it was inspired by the real life police vice squad kickback scandals of the late. The real life scandals were in the late 1940s, so it's a bit anachronistic. I moved it up about 5 years into the future, but that's what inspired that novel. So yes, it's roughly in the same period.
We have in the program at the end of this coming week a book by the defense attorney who had to turn prosecutor in the Kahalu'u case. In order to force the FBI to investigate. So it's not a novel, but it could easily be one. I mean, you have in Catherine Kahalu'u absolutely witch-like character. Somebody's going to have a juicy time with her. No.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't make that one up. Even James couldn't have written that.
It's a fascinating book. Did you? Are you enjoying the writing? now you've set this train going. Is it becoming a problem for you, or is it actually a release?
I am enjoying it now. I hope to do it as long as I continue enjoying it. Maybe one day I won't, and that's when I'll stop. But for now, it's great.
Do you want to do it full time?
I wish I could. I think I've never ever had any illusions that writing would allow me to quit my day job. I really wish that were true.
Yeah, that couldn't happen with the. I mean, I think you'd be pretty lucky to sell more than 3,000 copies in Hawaii, and you couldn't live off that. And I think that the problem I would see for a mainland publisher is not that it's an unpleasant topic, or at least I don't think that's a problem anymore. I think it is so specifically local, your writing, that it's if you're sitting in New York trying to figure out what's what, it's probably quite difficult to follow without a Google map by your side, you know. And the references are so specific to local culture and to local history. But I don't know, I could be absolutely wrong. It could be exactly what makes it go. You know.
Well, no, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I know that most writers will say, well, I try to write to the human experience so that everybody can identify with, no matter where you are, who you are. And that's why they should pick up this book and read it. But I wanted to write something that could not be set anywhere else or any time else. That was my criticism when I was complaining to my friend Jason in that bar in Kaimuki a decade ago about a lot of the literature that was set here, not that came out of here. I should clarify that, but that was set here, and I'm talking about mystery fiction. A lot of mystery. There's been a ton of mystery fiction that has been set here in Hawaii, mostly by writers who are not from here, and mostly by writers who don't live here. And when you read those stories, they're all kind of cookie cutter, and they're all kind of the same, whether they're noir or cozy, whether they're a traditional mystery or not, where the protagonist is almost always an outsider who comes here for the pretty backdrop, and they have their adventure here. But if you were to take that plot and set it anywhere else in the world, you'd have to you really wouldn't have to change very much except for the background. And I thought, you know, this place is so much more than that. It's so much more interesting than that, and the people here are so much more than that too. And that's why I wrote what I wrote. But you do run the risk of, you know, by injecting a certain amount of authenticity to your work and a certain amount of candor and honesty, you do run the risk that not everybody's going to get it, and I'm okay with that.
I thought so a good example of that is you have him going to the Big Island to stay with relatives, and that's Hilo in 1953 was a completely different world. You know? I mean, most of the novel is about urban Honolulu or based in urban Honolulu, but there you have the agricultural society that you were talking about earlier. But you paint a really very convincing, detailed picture of what that culture was like. How was that as a writing project? As a set piece, really.
Yeah, I had hoped to, and that was a lot of research too. I actually have relatives in Hilo, and I have not visited them as often as I maybe wished I could have recently. But I had hoped to get over there while we were in content edits on Red Dirt to do some really up close and in-depth research in Hilo itself, I was going to fly there and visit my Auntie Kako and Uncle Donald and go to the museum, the sugar museum, and visit Ola'a and do things like that. But the pandemic didn't allow for that. That's maybe one of the regrets I have about the research component of this book, was that it was not as complete as I had wanted it to be. Kona Winds, I actually got to walk into the Walter Murray Gibson building. I got to walk into the Alexander and Baldwin building, and I got to walk the streets downtown and absorb all of that. I wanted to do the same thing with Hilo, but alas, that didn't come to be. So I had to do this virtually, which really annoys me. You know, I had to do this through photographs. I had to do this through research. And I had to do this anecdotally. And Juliet Konoli, my editor, my content editor, was a great help in this during that phase, because she's from Hilo, and she was able to help me with those details.
Oh, well, it's a really good example. We have a question about from John Simons, who's a veteran newspaper guy. It says, in the local community's court of public opinion on the accused union officials, what roles were played by the print and broadcast news media? Were they part of the solution in seeking justice, or were part of the problem in piling on allegations? I just add a further comment. We haven't really talked about the principal character's girlfriend, Ellen, who is a journalist at a small newspaper. You actually don't, the media don't feature that much in this story. Was there a reason for that?
Yeah, it was really kind of peripheral. Ellen works for the Honolulu Record, which was a real life newspaper. It was the alternative newspaper to the two big newspapers, the Star Bulletin and the Advertiser, which we had for many years before they merged. And a lot of the controversy surrounding the Hawaii 7, a lot of it was editorial out of the two big newspapers, which were kind of anti-communist at the time. They were Haole-owned newspapers. They had a lot of money behind them, and they rode that wave in the 1950s of anti-communism. But the counterbalance to those papers was something like the Honolulu Record, and the Honolulu Record's founder, Koji Ariyoshi, was one of the Hawaii 7. He was one of those individuals that was up on Smith Act charges in 1953. And Ellen works for the Hawaii Record. It was on Sheridan Street. I think the address was one of those odd numbered addresses, so it may be where the Walmart parking lot is today. Yeah, I'm not sure, or across the street from it, but it was a real life newspaper. And the reason that a lot of I did not put a lot of the journalism aspect into the story was because, first and foremost, it is a story about murder. I think it's wrong to call what I write police procedural, though people have put it in that category, I think erroneously. If anything, it's an anti-procedural, right? I mean, because this was a time before Miranda versus Arizona and before those key Supreme Court decisions, which professionalized law enforcement. There were a lot of things going on, like beating confessions out of suspects and all kinds of other things that I don't want to say they never happen today, but there are consequences for employing methods like that. Back then, it was fairly wide open, and again, in a larger sense, that's why I like the setting is right on the verge of that change. But to have a story, I think that's focused on those elements. I thought about bringing maybe news pieces into the manuscript, but in the end, they didn't contribute as much, and in fact were kind of a distraction. So I did away with that idea very early on. Maybe I could have, and maybe it would have made for a deeper, richer book, but it would probably make it twice as long as what it was.
Well, there's another thread that similarly doesn't quite get the attention that perhaps it might have, which is the university's role, where the radicals were being particularly active and radical. I mean, not like the 60s yet, but it's where they were learning the theories of what they were talking about, so that, you know, that plays a part in the story. But what state was the university in 1953? I mean, was it obviously it wasn't as big as it is now. It was not a research university. It was a land grant university then. But did you do any research into that?
I touched on, as far as the university or the university's personnel's involvement in the House Un-American Activities Committee investigations. There were a couple of instances where academics were under investigation at one point by the HUAC. And the source that I read, and I think the most helpful, was a book called Fighting in Paradise by Gerald Horne, which kind of covers the gamut of the Hawaii labor movements at the time, and pays particular attention to the HUAC years. It really inspired a lot of the tone for the characters I created, who were involved in a lot of the activity that was being investigated by the HUAC in my book. And part of that was, and when those who haven't read the book yet, when you do read the book, you'll find that a lot of what went on in these so-called cells was not very radical at all. These folks kind of resembled sometimes more of a sewing circle than they did a real political action group. There was a lot of bickering and infighting. There was a lot of office politics, and it was about who got what and who got to do what. Typical stuff, you know, like a bowling league or something. That was fascinating, and I thought, this is too good not to put in my book. So when I read these accounts of these folks who were under investigation and learned about their activities and what they really amounted to, as opposed to what the investigators were alleging, it was actually kind of almost comical, and I had to inject that in there. So there's a chapter or two on that when you hit that in the book. Yeah.
Well, it's been a fascinating hour, and thank you very much for coming to the end. And we really look forward to the next book. And so that's, you say, is coming in 2023. Is that right?
Yeah, I think. Well, third book is I think coming out in 2023.
And so are you now actually in the fourth book?
I finished the manuscript for the fourth book. I don't know what the future of that is. That one is set, I believe, in 55, or actually late 54, but it jumps between 54 and 1942. That one was inspired by in part the sanctioned prostitution on Hotel Street during World War II, and all the accounts of that. So there are flashbacks to that, and how they relate to events in the current or the 1954 period. And that's complete. I don't know what the future of that is. I'm working on number 5 right now. Yeah.
Wow. Who's going to keep up with you?
No, well, I'll do it as long as I can. Who knows? Maybe I'll run out of ideas soon. Yeah.
Well, that's great. A lot to look forward to. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, thank you, Roger. Yeah, and I enjoyed it very much too.
Aloha. Attendees, you can, if you miss this or if your friends miss this, it's available or will be available on the Better Tomorrow speaker series in full on their website. And then we'll do a highlights version that will be up on Hawaii Book and Music Festival website for at least a year. So we'll be, by the time that year is over, we'll be chasing the next one. Thank you so much. Aloha.